Hello everyone, and thank you for taking a look at the presentation. My name is Irina Kalyanvaku. I'm a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Victoria. And with this slide deck, I'm going to talk to you about managing software engineers. This is something we investigated at Microsoft by looking at how developers and managers both experience and think about engineering management. This slide deck and recording are a companion to the paper with the same title, What Makes a Great Manager of Software Engineers, which is published in the Transactions of Software Engineering journal. You'll hear me say we during the presentation. That means myself, my mentor at Microsoft Research, Chris Bird, and also Tom Zimmerman, Andrew Bagel, Rob DeLine, and Daniel German. So let's get started. You may be asking yourselves, why talk about managers at all in software engineering? And we also wondered the same at the beginning. There are two reasons for that. Management in software engineering is both important and misunderstood. And let me briefly tell you why we believe this to be true. When we look at academic literature, we see that a lot of other domains have found that managers impact outcomes. You can see some examples here on the slide. There is plenty more in the paper. But in short, great managers have a positive impact on the performance of teams and organizations. And bad managers have a negative effect on employee engagement, on productivity, and the quality of the produced results. Now, in software engineering, recently we see the start of a discussion and a call for software development to be more aligned with business and strategic activities. And if that is the direction we are going, then we can see how relevant and important managers will be in this context too. At the same time, we need to be attuned to popular beliefs that practitioners hold since they affect their actions. So when we look at consulting companies and management-focused venues, we hear that managers have impact on people. One, they are believed to affect employee retention, and mostly that is talked about in a negative way. And two, they're seen as effective employee engagement, but at the same time that mostly people are not engaged at work. And the indication is that this affects the bottom line of organizations, that with more engaged employees, companies do better. And if that is the case, then the manager is critical in this setting too. Now, outcomes and people. These are both important in software engineering too, yet management here is a bit misunderstood. The domain seems to be unsure about how to manage software engineers, and you can see this in the energy spent comparing with other domains, either in articles or anecdotally, and most of the times you get both sides of the story. Other times it shows up as skepticism of whether management is even needed in software engineering, or maybe there are other proxies for it in this case. For example, Google explored the idea of replacing managers with a good, solid software engineering process, and as part of an experiment a few years back, decided to remove them. It ended up finding that managers are impactful and convinced itself through its own evidence. But debates and conversations like these indicate confusion about what is it that is relevant in management for this domain. We tried to remedy that by generating evidence from within software engineering about what it values in managers. And so we wanted to find out what makes a great manager of software engineers. You will find a lot more details in the paper about how we approached this, but we followed a three-step approach. First, we interviewed 37 people at Microsoft, and to get as rich a picture as possible, we involved developers, leads, managers, and managers of different demographics. We asked them about what attributes they thought were important for great engineering managers, but also why and how to get the context. So someone says, for example, that they have seen great managers defend the developer's time. Great. That means that this is an attribute that we pick up. And then we ask why that is important and how they have seen it in practice. We qualitatively analyzed the input from the interviews and collected 83 items that interviewees considered important. We used card sorting on those and ended up with 15 attributes arranged in a conceptual framework. In the second phase, we used those 15 attributes to design a survey for a larger population. We asked people to rate the importance of the attributes, to indicate their agreement with statements about them, and make scenario-based hiring decisions. We tested significance and compared between demographics to draw our conclusions. Our third phase was a redeployment of the validation survey, now with other knowledge worker groups inside Microsoft. We followed the same analysis process, but we were now able to compare between the responses coming from the different disciplines to give synthesized conclusions. Before we dive in, a couple of clarifications. First, the role we investigated is called an engineering manager. And at Microsoft, they are a first-line manager, someone who is in charge of one or more teams made up of engineers and maybe leads. The second point is about using the term a great manager in the rest of the presentation. What that means is what engineers and managers perceive as important for engineering managers that are seen as great. For simplicity, we just use the term a great manager. So let's take a look at what we learned. And for this presentation, I'm keeping it about the attributes we discovered matter and how they characterize the role. The results of the 2 validation surveys we run about these attributes can be found in the paper. Here's a framework that surfaced from the qualitative analysis, and let's see how to read this. There are 15 attributes on this framework. 2 of them are on the top left, and then the rest in the main area of the diagram. Here's how to read this. Starting from the top left, overarching and across the board, great managers need to be available, and they need to be some level of technical, and I'll be coming back for that one. Then great managers were described as having 3 functions. They cultivate engineering judgment, they motivate the people they're responsible for, and they mediate their presence in the organization. And if you look at that from the point of whether managers are doing that for an individual or for a team, you get which attributes come into play when. I'm going to take you through 3 attributes: supports experimentation, recognizes individuality, and drives alignment. I chose these to give us coverage of both levels of interaction and all 3 functions. And of course, the paper has descriptions and in-depth explanations for all 15. A great manager was described as someone that supports experimentation of 2 kinds. Engineers that need to play around with things when they are dealing with an unknown task, or developers that work on side projects. And in both cases, experimentation was seen as a top-notch learning opportunity. But when experimenting, things are uncertain. The strategy that was described was for the great engineering manager to provide a safe environment for engineers to experiment and possibly fail. An engineer described how she experienced that with her manager. The manager I had told me before I started that if it doesn't work out, it's okay. As long as he knew I put in my effort, he was going to support me and not let it affect my review, and he stuck to his word. A downside to not having these clear signals that experimentation is safe was described as engineers that refrain from trying out new things, and so they're possibly refraining from innovating. For experimentation through side projects, there's a trade-off that shows up when a side project turns out so well that it now has the potential to become part of a product. Technical debt becomes a consideration in this case, and the strategy was for the great engineering manager to create a culture of quality that applies even to experiments. An engineering manager described this to us. He said, "We built someone's fun project into a product at one instance, and since we're relying on that tool, we have debt now to pay because the person was treating it as a hobby and wanted to make progress fast in the background. We encourage that, but if we don't do it with some quality gates, we inherit more debt later." A great manager was described as recognizing individuality. Engineers have different preferences in terms of tech stacks and development tools and even types of tasks they want to work on or become good at. And they also have all sorts of different strengths and weaknesses. A great engineering manager tailors the work to the engineer's interests and skills to make sure that they're engaged and to help them grow. This makes developers feel better about what they do. For example, an engineer here said, "I had a manager that first asked me what I was interested in and what I like and what my talents are, and he tried to give me work related to that. I feel a lot more comfortable and happier like that." And indeed, a lot of interviewees linked the presence of this attribute to how productive they felt. Finally, a great manager was described as driving alignment. What that means is that they help engineers see how their work links to higher level business goals. This is a connection that a lot of the times engineers miss, especially when, as in this case, they are given a lot of autonomy on how to approach their task, and then they go deep into the details of implementation. An engineering manager pointed out that risk. He said, "The way I see it, every team member are the experts of their area, and they know the best things that could come out of that, but they can push in different directions." So how can a manager both give the autonomy to engineers to exercise their own judgment and at the same time make sure they're going down a path that ultimately will serve the business and strategy goals? He went on to say, "I pose a question along the lines of, hey, here are some of the challenges our business is facing. How do you think you can help in these respects? Here are some thoughts or maybe seeds of lines of thinking, but help us come up with a strategy together. What are some things that we can do to get there?" So the manager here is not described as a micromanager that tells other people what to do, but as someone that tries to engage and involve developers in conversations about strategy to get their input. And through that activity, engineers see how their work fits with the bigger scope and they remain aligned with it. Now I would like to draw your attention to one attribute in particular, and that is being technical. I promised I was coming back to that one. Everyone in the interviews mentioned that a great engineering manager needs to be technical, and they use exactly those words. But what does that mean? We went back to everyone we interviewed and asked them to explain that part. And they told us the great manager needs to understand enough to follow the work of the engineers, to have intelligent conversations with them when they get stuck, and to help them think through the problem to get unstuck. So for example, the manager understands the lingo and understands the systems the team is working on and what it takes to get the job done. But that was it. They are not actively programming and they don't interject themselves into the programming specifics. Otherwise, what was described was diminishing returns for the team. Continuing to program and being great at it makes a manager a linchpin for the team and denies engineers the opportunity to learn by doing hard things because the manager is taking care of them. So the description of the engineering manager role was almost completely separated from what a software engineer does. In the survey, we used a scenario-based question to understand the engineers' and managers' expectations about what the balance should be between technical and social skills. We asked respondents to pick one of two candidates for a manager position and justify their choice. And you can find the precise description we used in the survey instrument we are sharing. But one candidate was described as excellent technically and competent socially, while the other one as competent technically and excellent socially. 3/4 of the respondents indicated they would choose a manager with great people skills, even though they're average technically, over someone who was awesome in programming. And how did they justify it? By highlighting how critical the people management aspect of the role is. For example, their work as a great manager is to enable reports to perform as brilliant engineers themselves. It is more important to manage people than to manage the product. And here's another justification. Ultimately, management is about people. If there's a weakness in somebody's technical skills, this is a gap that can be closed with effort. But lack of people and social skills, lack of empathy, or inability to bring people and personalities together to solve common problems, that's very hard to bridge, indicating that a deficit in technical skills is easier to absorb than a deficit in social skills. So here are a couple of takeaways to summarize what we learned and some of the questions that it creates down the line. In terms of how to manage software engineers, we now know more about what attributes matter to people in software engineering when it comes to management. We have a framework of 15 attributes that covers different management functions and levels of interaction, and we can use those as guides. Some of the attributes appear in other domains as well, and what that signals is that we can potentially borrow from others' experiences. These experiences may need to be tailored to fit, and we discuss some strategies from the software engineers' lingo and their experience and what they value more. Keep in mind that sometimes the field is skeptical about management in software engineering, and people may need to be convinced. And hopefully what we presented here can help in that direction. In terms of our research, there are a lot more things to look at. People talked about management, something that's traditionally outside the development pipeline, as having an impact on outcomes like productivity and the quality of the produced software. Is that true? And what is the nature of that influence? And how can we capture it so that we can measure it and potentially improve it? The other thing that stood out and should be considered is the nature of the engineering manager's role. It was described as very different from being an engineer and requiring essentially a different skill set. We heard from people that transitioned from one role to the other, and they found it challenging to understand how the role was different and where the line is between actively participating and creating output yourself versus supporting the people that do. This opens questions about how to select and promote engineering managers. The stereotype and a common practice is to promote an excellent engineer to become engineering manager, sometimes as a reward for their performance or in recognition of their skills. But what we found was that that perhaps is not the best approach, since the skills and attributes that make great engineering managers are different from the ones that make great engineers. And how do we train, in this case, how to support engineers to become engineering managers and to smoothly transition into their role? Is training better to take place on the job? before the transition, or should we be looking at incorporating some of these elements as early on as the education of software engineers? As a reminder, the quantitative results of the attributes I mentioned and all the rest of the 15 are presented in detail in the paper. There you can find the attributes ranked by importance, a comparison in views between demographics, as well as a comparison of views between software engineering and other disciplines inside Microsoft like program management, business process and operations, and others. So to sum everything up, the field is having a hard time knowing how to manage software engineers, and there are a lot of mixed messages and some disbelief. We focused on understanding what is relevant to software engineering by finding what managerial qualities it values. We characterized the engineering manager role through 15 attributes that can be used as a guide on how to manage software engineers. And although engineering managers definitely need to be technical, we found that that's not necessarily the thing that makes them great. Thank you very much for watching this presentation. I will leave you with contact details if you have any questions and a link to the research instruments and the paper itself. Feel free to reach out to us with your comments, your feedback, or your experience because we would love to hear from you. Thank you.